Today we have Clayton Coke, who is the managing director of PRMS and a creator of the Cash Flow podcast. We're going to discuss the importance of having a business mindset and the need to focus on sacrifice in entrepreneurship. Clayton shares his experiences in debt recovery and the challenges faced by his business. He also talks about his podcast and the lessons he has learned from interviewing successful entrepreneurs. This conversation will touch on the roles and risks of the entrepreneur and the importance of listening and learning from others. This episode concludes with a discussion with Clayton about his future plans and the legacy he hopes to leave behind. If you are enjoying this content, thank you very much for joining me. Please do give it a thumbs up. Please do give it a like. Also, if you've got any thoughts about who you'd like me to interview, leave it in the comments below and just hit the subscribe button. It really does help with the algorithm. I'd super appreciate if you were able to click that subscribe button. Okay, over into the interview. Today we have Clayton Coke, who is the managing director of PRMS and the creator of the Cash Flow podcast. Hello, Clayton. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Mark. How are you doing?
I'm really good. Thank you so much for joining me today. We actually met at the London podcast show, which was really good couple of days. I had a really good time speaking to lots of people, and we met through Gerard, didn't we? That was how we connected. So, how did you enjoy the show, first of all?
The show was fantastic. It was a lot going on, a lot in a very. It seemed 2 days seemed like a long period of time, but in reality, by the time you got talking to somebody, you had to go to a talk here and then run up the stairs to another talk there, and so by the time you did it, you were absolutely knackered.
Yeah, it was a full-on couple of days, but I had a lot of fun. I met a load of wonderful people in the podcast industry, and had such a great time. So I would definitely promote anyone that's in the podcast industry, whatever area, to maybe look that up in May 2024 now. So that'll be next year. So great to meet you, Clayton. Okay, the podcast show is called The Absolute Business Mindset. What does a business mindset mean to you?
To me, it's about having the decks in your life clear so you can concentrate on where you want to get to.
What do you mean? What direction are you specifically looking to, and how
I
have you
remember a
done that?
friend of mine wanted to start a business, and I said to her, "You can start a business, but your mindset is all wrong. You've got too many things going on." She was looking after her mom. She had adult children who she was effectively looking after, even though they didn't need looking after. She was spending a lot of money. She wasn't living as focused as an entrepreneur. And the business mindset is that you are going to have to make sacrifices. You are going to have to give up meeting people. You are going to have to give up going out. You're going to have to give up watching TV. You're going to have to give up loads of things in order to become this entrepreneur, in order to become anything that's near remotely successful.
Really interesting. Two words that spring out from what you just said is focused, and I can tell you by my experience. So I worked at all my audience know this. I worked in corporate for 14 years, and then left and became an entrepreneur about 3.5 years ago. And when I first left my job, I ended up starting 4 businesses, all doing so property and coaching and my podcast and there's various other things, and I found that I wasn't being focused enough on 1 or 2 things to really make the most of it. So I think that's absolutely right, and I still suffer from the shiny penny syndrome, shiny object syndrome. When I still have ideas. I've had 2 business ideas this year which I think are real goes, and I've spoken to a few people about them, just sort of getting like sounding them off, and they like, yeah, they're really good ideas, but I'm just like, I want to get, so the podcast agency, which we talked about when we met, I need to get that up and running, that it's sustainable without me actually in the business. That's both me and my business partner's aim, is to be at that point where it's sustainable without us. And we're not there yet. We're not quite there yet. But I always get drawn with ideas that I have, or sometimes other people's ideas that they have, and you're like, oh, we could really make that work. Is that something you suffer from?
Yes, it's classic entrepreneur behavior. Every day you've got an idea. Every day you've got an idea. However, it's the idea of resisting that temptation.
Mm,
It's like the the crux of it is this, is that you have to look at an idea and see whether everybody thinks an idea is a great idea until you actually start to do the deep dive.
yeah,
And that's when you realize where the problems are, and
yeah,
where, as the idea that you thought of it, you think, I can't think of why nobody's thought of this before.
mm,
And
mm,
they probably have thought of it before, but they've got as far as you've got and then
yeah.
decide this is not a good idea. I solve that quite easily. I've got a Trello board.
Oh, right. Yeah,
Those that don't know, Trello is what's a variation of a Kanban board,
yeah,
and it's a board that basically used to be able to do it on with index cards, and it
yeah,
moves from left to right.
yeah,
So the start of the project is on the left, which is your right in probably in this thing, and you move across
yeah,
until you get to the end. So for me, if I've got an idea about um garden hoses. So I think I'm going to be sell garden hoses. So
right.
I then put the idea: garden hose, what are garden hoses made of? Blah blah blah. Where
Yeah,
can I sell them? So
yeah,
on and so forth. And then I basically keep that idea there. I may
yeah,
come back to it. I may never come back to it.
mm,
Gets
mm,
it out of my brain and
yeah,
into a particular onto paper, if you like, or
yeah,
in the cloud, and then I deal with it from that particular point. I've had ideas, we were talking briefly before we started recording about this podcast that I'm doing, this documentary podcast. I've
yeah,
had documentary podcast for yonks, but I've
yeah,
not only just got round to do it. All the things I do a bit, I leave it, I do a bit, I leave it.
mm,
And
mm,
sometimes that feasibility comes to an end where I'll
yeah.
be able to publish, say, next week. And sometimes things never get published.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And to be honest, I don't want to stop that mindset of being able to think of ideas, because I think that helps. Even thinking about another business, even if it's only for an hour or two, it can help your actual business that you're running, because you're thinking about things in a different way, thinking about different things, which can really benefit your current business as well. So I think because there's a guy called James Altucher who's and he talks about the muscle, your mind being a muscle.
Yes.
And so he writes 10 ideas every day about different things. It could be a product he buys, it could be a service that he does, it could be something to do with his kid's school, and he will just do that every day. And it was an exercise that I did for quite a long time, just making sure that my mind was keep on thinking about other things and how to improve them. So I do think that sort of muscle memory and keeping that muscle working is a real positive for an entrepreneur. You
No,
just don't want to just follow every dream that you have.
no, no, you can't follow every dream because it's just not practical. Even the multimillionaires and billionaires of this world never follow every single dream.
Yeah,
So that it's unsustainable. But the
yeah,
fact is that every idea, at least if you get that idea out, that is so important. I'm always on my phone sending ideas to myself,
yeah,
because I operate in lots of different things. I do I do debt recovery and late payments. I do podcasting. I'm also involved in music and songwriting. If I get a songwriting idea, I put that down every
yeah.
single day. So it keeps that, as you said, that muscle working.
Yeah. Okay. So tell me about your podcast. So it's called the Cash Flow Show podcast. And I know that you do it on podcast radio as well. Do you release it as a podcast as well as on the radio?
Yes, it's a separate podcast. Initially, what happened was that we were um let's go back about 6 years ago. I decided that it would be a great idea to actually get involved in podcasting. I'd seen this thing called podcasting, but I didn't really know much about it. I knew you needed a microphone, I knew you needed to talk into it, and I knew you needed to record it. And because I'd been involved in music and writing songs, I knew how to set things up pretty basically. So I had a rough idea. I was going to be a major engineer, but at the end of the day, at least I could get something recorded that
Yeah.
didn't sound too shoddy. So I thought maybe this might be a good idea to work with in the business to give people a different angle, because I think my principal business is late payments and debt recovery and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And that's got quite a negative reputation.
Mm.
So I wanted it to attract people to me as an individual in terms of I'm not a scary person. This is not a scary situation. This is a human being behind all of this financial stuff.
Mm.
But that seems to have taken on a life of its own. And it's basically an interview podcast where we talk to one person from business. We ask them how they got started, how they grew their business. For me, the most important things, what went wrong?
Mm.
What
Yeah.
went that I love the bits that go wrong. Maybe there's something quite weird about me, but I'm always intrigued as why people went wrong. What was a mistake? I like detective novels as well, or
Right.
detective TV series. How did the killer get caught? What was the mistake that they made
Mm.
that put them in that position? So by starting the podcast, I then decided to sort of ask anybody I could find. I was sort of saying, "Do you want to be on a podcast?" And people were saying, "What's a podcast?" So that was a bit of a hurdle. So it's not like fast forward now, 6, 7 years later, everybody, a cat and his dog has got a podcast. But for me, it was all about sharing information about entrepreneurs that I didn't want to be the way that sort of Stephen Bartlett went, which is
Mm.
I'm sort of famous, so I'm going to have loads and loads of famous people on.
Mm.
Famous people don't really interest me because they're already famous.
Mm. Mm.
So I'm not interested in that. I've got certain people who've been on my show who I know will be famous in the future. And that's
Mm.
a nice feeling to see people as they come up. So starting the show really meant finding people who I knew in the business community via my networking. I used to network very heavily, and then effectively asking them to sit down and share. And that was different. And that was
Mm.
actually quite difficult
Yeah.
because you mentioned earlier before we started running about the difference between American guests and UK guests. And I don't know if you've felt the situation that when you ask an American guest, it's like, yeah, I'm ready. They're charged up, they're fired up, they're ready to go. You just ask them, do you want to be on a podcast? It's like, yeah, right, back at you, no messing about. Whereas with British people, it's literally you've asked them to sit in the dentist chair and you're pulling teeth. They do not want to do it. You really have to. I've had to try to nearly pursue people. At
Mm.
the end, I
Mm.
gave up because I decided that you either want to be on the show or you don't want to be on the show. There are
Yeah.
some people saying, well, they want you to be rich and famous or, have 1 million of downloads before they come on your show. And I'm thinking, well, you haven't even got a show, so what are you complaining about?
Yeah. Yeah.
But you learn from that.
Yeah, and it always makes me laugh with Stephen Bartlett with the Diary of CEO, the evolution of his podcast from very much almost like talking to a microphone about his business, which is kind of where I started. I started talking about business from an early stage. But what I now think of, I still watch some of the episodes and find them quite interesting. But I always think now he's moved to the position where all he wants to do is get his guests to cry. Like he can then get the clip at the start of the YouTube video where the person's sobbing into their hands, and have you noticed that he now always hits this moment where it's like we'll go deep into this subject, and he's sort of angling for them to get upset and cry.
Yeah, something that's not authenticity to me. I think at the end of the day, that's sadism to a certain extent. I'm sorry. That's not authenticity to me. I don't want to see you cry. I'm be handing you a handkerchief. Pull yourself together, man. Come on. You're on television, man. You're live. Get yourself together. I'm not there to make you cry. I'm there for you to learn from your mistake.
Mm.
What that mistake? The same way that I've learned from my mistakes.
So, what is your biggest mistake to do with the podcast?
God, how many? The biggest mistake, the first mistake was putting it on SoundCloud before I knew what an internet, no, what a hosting provider was. That was my
Right.
big mistake. The second big mistake was asking a friend who kept on letting me down and really didn't want to do it,
Mm.
and discouraged by that. And that's the
Okay.
easiest thing in podcasting. When things aren't working, you get discouraged.
Yeah.
I should have then gone the Stephen Bartlett route and just done some podcast episodes for myself. But because I'd started with an interview format, I wanted to maintain that. I think the third mistake was not realizing how powerful publishing regularly is, how
Yeah.
people look for your podcast. And if it's not there, they then move elsewhere.
Yeah.
If there's
Yeah.
nothing on telly, you're going to go and watch something else.
Consistency is absolutely critical, isn't it?
It is.
Absolutely critical.
And I have to be honest with you, I am not always the most consistent because unfortunately, life gets in the way.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's hard. It's hard, but I think I've learned a lot more about that. And it's, I think the difficulty with running a podcast is that if you want it to be of a certain standard, there's a
Mm.
lot of effort that's involved.
Yes.
A lot
Yes.
of it, but you can't
Yes.
just sit down and say, right. And I noticed with a lot of younger people, they seem to sit down and they're sitting on a sofa. Somebody's switched on an iPhone and they're all laid
Yeah.
back and they're sort of just talking to me as a grown man. I suppose sounds like rubbish to them. It's the height of hilarity, and they're
Yeah.
just having in jokes and whatever the case may be. And maybe I'm just 25 years too old, and maybe that's what it is. But I think the reality of the situation is that finding out who you are in the podcast space is hard
Mm.
because there are so many people doing so many different things. And
And I found that finding, like, the reason why I started it initially was because I started doing a lot more presentations and sort of for my work when I was in corporate, and I started doing sort of sales to like 100, 200 people, and I was agonizing over my content that I was producing, and this was starting to become a little bit more regular, and I just thought, what would be great is publish a podcast. I had 3 people listen to it probably for the first 6 months, and that wasn't necessarily quality wise wasn't very good either, but um it was an exercise for me to prepare, think
yeah,
about, and then be able to communicate a message that I wanted to share, and be able to do it quite quickly and having a quick turnaround. So, because what I was finding, I was agonizing over this like 30-minute presentation to 100 people, and I was just like, this isn't sustainable. If I'm going to be doing this more and more, I need to, put in inverted commas, find my voice. And that's what I actually did on the podcast. And that's why for a long time, I probably did 100 episodes just me talking, because it was an exercise to make me a better communicator. The interview stuff came further down the line. And actually, it was speaking to a friend of mine, Andy Arto, who's a great friend of mine who's in the podcast world as well. And he said, look, why don't you interview as well? So I was like, oh, okay. So I did the first interview with him. There was all sorts of mistakes, but it was brilliant. And I had such a fun time hearing about his story, hearing about his business, what he was doing, that I was like, actually, this having a conversation with someone and, as you say, learning from their experiences, learning from successes and failures was so important that I've just kept on doing the interview style. And that's really changed my passion from, I need to be a better communicator. And then you work out you have to be a better interviewer and ask the right questions to get the best things from your guests. What have you learned from the experience of interviewing people? How have you sort of developed that skill set to be able to ask the best questions to get the most out of your guests?
listening. I think stereotypically, most women will say that men don't listen. Women will always say that men. I was one of those different guys. I was always a guy. I always had girlfriends that said, "You listen," and I always listened and pay attention. I always was that kind of person. And I'm. I think you can learn a lot by listening to people. I choose people to come on the show that I'm a fan of. I
Mm,
like what you're doing. The more unusual the thing is, the more I'm interested in. And
mm,
I'm interested in as a fan, but not as a gushing fan, but as a fan that says, how does this really work?
mm.
Is this how do you feel about this? What does it make you say? What does it make you do? What made you realize that you needed to leave your job?
Mm.
What made you realize that you needed to find somewhere else? Was it when you were sleeping under the arches? That kind of thing.
Mm.
It's about responding to people. And I think what like I learned about podcasting was, especially as an interviewer, talk less, listen more.
Yeah.
Make it so that the bits that the audience gloss over, you pick up and reel back in and
Mm.
get to the depths of where people are. Get to their soul, not the Stephen Bartlett method of making people cry. I'm not interested in you crying. Crying is for when you're at home and
Yeah.
you're by yourself. Crying in front of an audience, that's to me is not cool. That's a private thing. However, where did you go wrong? What would you have done differently?
Yeah.
And where does it take you now?
Yeah.
So for me as an interviewer, I learned that pay attention to what your guest is saying. Put yourself in that same position and be the best cheerleader for your guest. You're listening to the hero's journey. You want them to succeed.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing. A lot of people have people on their shows because they are fulfilling a an obligation or a role. Somebody set that person up. I
Mm.
will not have certain people on my show, not because I don't like them, but because I can't see a way of me approaching it as a cheerleader.
Mm.
I've got to make the audience think this person is the nicest person. I've got to bring out the questions in them that the other person's thinking, yeah, how did you do that?
Mm.
Why
Mm.
did you do that?
Mm.
And also my show isn't necessarily about the business aspect of it. It's about you as an individual.
Yeah.
It opens the door that says to people, when you meet this guy at the next networking or the next wine and cheese party, you can ask them about Star Wars and
Mm.
you can open up a dialogue. I've been in those networking events where I'm stood there like a complete lemon. And I remember many years ago, my initial career it was in law. And at that time, we would be invited to barristers' chambers events. And they were all very, very posh and very, 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 very. And I would be there. I'd be the only black guy in the room, literally the only black guy in the room. So I'm stood there holding on to my little glass of wine, stutter, completely paranoid. And I remember it looked so bad. I went there, and it was this chap called Sir Geoffrey Bryce, QC. And it sounds like I had a name, but he was a really pleasant guy. He goes, I can see that you're not used to these type of events. May I make a suggestion that what you should do is ask people about their latest case and they'll be able to do. And he was absolutely right. That
Yeah.
was the icebreaker,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
And the whole thing of networking as well as podcasting is you've got two ears and one mouth. Use them in the right proportion, please.
That's when you take the Queen Elizabeth II approach. What do you do? What do you do? Yeah.
So you move.
My impressions are terrible, so please read everything. But that was a classic line. What do you do? That opens up everything.
Yeah. So let's move on to debt recovery. So you started as a debt recovery consultant. How did you get into it's a very niche area. How did you get into it?
Well, I have to go back to the beginning. Effectively, when I left school, I really wanted to be involved in law, and a job came up as an outdoor clerk, which is effectively a runner. And what you did was you went to the court, you picked things up, you collected stuff, you went to solicitors, firms, and in those days they did things what were called completions. And the completion was when the buyer and the seller of a property would get together and
Mm.
exchange contracts. And effectively, I had to go to it was the it's it's now a Sainsbury's, but that shows how long ago it was. But it was the Midland Bank in High Holborn, the top in right at the crossroads between High Holborn and
Yeah.
Kingsway.
Yeah.
And I, I had to go there in the mornings and collect a banker's draft.
Yeah.
That's how long ago. I collect the banker's draft, and that literally was the money. So if
Mm.
If at that time, suppose the property was say 50,000. So I had 50,000 worth of banker's draft made out to a particular firm's solicitors in my little briefcase, the office
Yeah.
briefcase, along with the conveyancing papers. And I
Mm.
had to hand over the banker's draft and the conveyancing paper because it was all done physically. Now it's all done electronically.
Yeah.
So things like that. So that was to get a taste of going to court and finding out that things didn't work and get sent back, and it pouring down with rain and having to go back to the court again. And so you did the hard lines, really. You did
Yeah.
the hard work in order to do that. So then I got into becoming a legal exec, and effectively I think they call it a paralegal now. Oh, but
Right.
legal execs do still exist.
Yeah.
You basically did all the work of, say a solicitor, but at a slightly lower level.
Mm.
And you could actually go through the ranks and then become a solicitor. So I was a legal exec for sort of many years. I worked in private practice. I worked in local authorities. I worked in-house. And then at some point I realized that I didn't really want to do it anymore. And I wanted to try and do something else, but it was difficult. I couldn't get out of it because every time somebody would say, "Oh, you've been involved in law, you've been involved in this." And
Right.
it became one of those scenarios you couldn't get out of. You kept on being dragged back into it. So I needed cash. So if effectively what happened was at one stage I was offered a role as a locum at a firm in Hertfordshire. It was in Hatfield, and at that time I was a Southeast London man, a young man, and I didn't know anything about Hatfield. That was the country as far as I was concerned. So I then decided to go for this job, and I thought, okay, let's try it out. But they said, oh, it's a debt collection job. They are a business and they've got loads and loads of debt. Would you like to do it? And I thought, okay, what's the worst that could happen? So I go along there and they say, right, we've got all this debt. They were a nursing agency. They would send out nurses, send out doctors, and have people in nursing homes or whatever, but people weren't paying.
Right.
So my job was to basically get this money back. So they said, well, here's a desk, here's a chair, here's a telephone. So there were some other people there. Let's get this money in. So I had
Do,
to ring up.
do you have heavies? Which is probably
No, this is a common misconception. This was one of the main reasons for doing the podcast,
right.
because I wanted people to move away from the idea that they were heavies. Because, I am not a very average build. I'm not very tall at all. So when people see me in real life, it's like, oh, and I think the name Clayton M Coke says to people that this is a 6 foot wide black American guy, and I think that's and that's not the case at all. I'm not 6 foot tall and I'm not 6 foot wide, so much to other people's disappointments. Ladies, I'm sorry, I can't help you there. But the reality for me was that I was in a position where I needed to help to recover these debts and do it in the most sophisticated way. So all the experience I'd had as a legal exec, all the experience I'd had of going to court, knowing what things were to be done and the order that they were to be done in, allowed me to do this. So I did that. It was a 3-month contract initially, and I was there ultimately for about 18 months when they called me in and said, "Oh, sorry to have to break this to you, but we haven't got any more work for you."
Oh.
So that was great. I completed my mission. I'd done what I set out to do, but it then gave me the idea, maybe I could do this as a business.
Right. And that was where you set up PRMS.
That's correct.
And that's been going a long time, 20 odd years.
21 years this year.
Wow.
21 years.
What have you learned from failing businesses? Is there a theme that you can say that why businesses fail in that sense?
I think a lot of businesses start off with best intentions. They really genuinely start off with the best intentions. But I do feel that people do not watch the pennies. They do not look at how they are spending their money as a business. They're not, they don't sit, for example, a lot of businesses, what it's taught me is a lot of people are in debt. And I don't mean necessarily in debt because of a debt recovery situation, but a lot of people borrow a lot of money in order to maintain businesses.
Mhm.
And it's taught me, I have got a dear friend of mine, Lisa Newton, who's a bookkeeper. And together we've come up with this theory that most people in business are not worth anything at all. They
Mhm.
are literally that much away from losing the whole lot, because everything is based on loans upon loans upon loans upon loans. And that's really what a lot of people, very few people are cash trading businesses.
Mhm.
Everybody owns a massive amount. And I think what I learned from it is that very people and the banks are very quick to help you mortgage your house or help you provide some kind of pledging in order that you end up in a position where you lose. I mean, I've had situations where, and sadly, it's always been a man, where the man has basically gone behind his wife's back,
Oh,
pledged money to a bank or a build society or a loan company in order
mm,
to get funds for a business. The business has failed, and the wife doesn't realize half the house that she's in doesn't belong to her.
yeah,
And it causes terrible situation. It causes,
yeah.
then the wife leaves and the children leave, then the cat leaves and the dog leaves, everybody leaves. And it's a complete disaster. And I think a lot of people get, because we're told that business is so easy, and everybody can be a multimillionaire and everybody can be a success. There's something like between maybe 50, 60 billion pounds of debt that's owed between SME businesses.
Mm. But it's interesting because when I went on my sort of personal journey, my self-development journey, which encompassed books like Rich Dad Poor Dad and Traction and all the ones that everyone else has read and enjoyed. One of the things they do talk about is positive debt or leverage that you can use.
Yeah.
Now, from what you said there, taking out a loan to be able to pay your suppliers and then taking out another loan to pay your suppliers is a negative way of being able to use debt, because you're essentially robbing from Peter to pay Paul, which I get as a definite, because one of the things I learned and I took from things like Rich Dad Poor Dad is and Profit First is that you leveraging is useful, but you do need an element of cash. And I think some of our influencers that talk about the Grant Cardones and people like Rob Moore and people like that are saying that leverage and debt is good and you need to get into debt to be. Now, I actually think the bit they're missing is you need a layer of cash to make sure that you are liquid at all times. And that's sometimes the mismessage that you get from the influencers that are saying that, oh, you need to leverage and cash is trash and all this stuff like that. What's your view on, as a debt recovery specialist, on that role as cash, the liquidity of cash in your business?
Cash never goes out of fashion. Doesn't matter whatever's going on, cash will always be accepted somewhere. Simple as that. The people with the Grant Cardones and stuff like that, those guys are successful. I'm not there to knock them, but they are there to appeal to a certain type of person. I'm not their demographic.
What
Now,
is their type of person? I've often mused and thought about their
well,
target
I believe
demographic.
that their type of person is a person who is either a natural risk taker anyway, so we'll do it. They'll bet on the two snails crawling along the grass, that type of person.
Yeah.
They're either natural risk takers or people that can be influenced, because those people are influencers. They change people's behavior
Mm,
in order to get them to act in a particular way. Now,
mm,
the reality of it is, my mum always used to say you should pick sense from nonsense, because a lot of these people, they give the impression they don't know your life, but they're giving you advice in relation to your life. How
mm,
does that work?
mm,
Doesn't make any sense. Now, for me, I think that personally, risk there. I'm not. I've only started taking risk, big risk, really, or bigger risks in the last 7 years, 10 years. I'm not. I don't see myself as a risk taker. I'm not the type of person that will turn around and mortgage my house so that I can get such and such and such.
Yeah.
Why? Because the fact is, do I really need it? Do I really want it? And the fact is, will I put myself in debt so I don't sleep at night for the
Mm.
benefit of having something just to show other? Most people get in debt to show other people that they have something.
Yeah.
That's one thing I've noticed. People get in debt to buy big SUVs.
Mm.
But the fact is, and people think they own those SUVs, they don't. They're leasing. They're a personal car plan.
Yeah.
So within 3 years or whatever, or 10,000 miles or whatever, that goes back. If you stop paying, it goes back. You
Yeah.
don't own it.
Yeah.
But the problem is people want to perpetuate a certain type of image.
Yeah.
And Grant Cardone's appeal to a certain type of almost toxic masculinity. It's like we're men and we take risks and we get big rewards because we take big risks. The people that are famous and who are rich at the end of the day, they've all come from wealthy families. And that's what people don't do.
I do think as an entrepreneur, though, you have to because I took a risk leaving my corporate job and doing it on my own.
Oh, great.
And so I do think as an entrepreneur, you have to embrace risk
Yes.
to an extent.
Yes,
Now,
you do.
what I try and do is I try and mitigate the risks by working out what those positions are, and then being able to think of exits if I need to leave the business or leave the property or whatever, because I've got properties that I rent. And so I'm at the moment, I'm converting one into an Airbnb.
Correct.
Now
Brilliant.
that's a risk for me. I've got stable rental income that I know is coming in, and I can sign it off tomorrow, and I would just get a check every month. But I've decided to take a risk on. I've still got to pay my mortgage, but I'm going to trial it for 6 months to 12 months to see if it works in this situation. Now that's a risk from my point of view, but I do think as an entrepreneur, you do have to take risks to be successful.
Okay.
So I just want to challenge you on that slightly, in that I think risk is a necessity as an entrepreneur, but the way you do it successfully, or way I think you do it successfully, is trying to think of how to mitigate those risks as best you can.
Okay. I should then sum up my perspective in a fewer set of words. Most people know the concept of risk. What Grant Cardone and others like him, they promote recklessness.
Yes, 100%.
And you see, so I mean, to be honest with you, I can't say that I'm not a risk taker. I'm just not a reckless person,
Yeah.
because I've taken risks all throughout my life, but I never saw them as risks. It's been maybe because I sat down and thought them through. And
Yeah.
I sat down and like in getting into some podcasting, that's a risk.
Mm,
Because but it's a calculated risk. There's nothing
exactly.
reckless about it.
And I
And
think that's so important.
yeah, and you make a very good point. You cannot do entrepreneurship without risk. There is no two ways. Even if you're just risking a fiver, it's a fiver that you could go to Greg's and have a couple of steak bakes and a drink.
Yeah.
That's a risk. You're risking your lunch. I mean, Berry Gordy of the Motown Empire always used to have meetings where they'd play the latest Smokey Robinson record or whatever, and he'd say to the committee, "Would you skip your lunch to buy this record?"
Mm, right.
And that was a fantastic test, because when I was younger, I skipped lunch to buy records.
Mm.
So
So,
I know.
so let's just talk about this. I'm conscious of time, but
Please.
you were in Radiogram Records as well. You were a CEO there.
Yeah.
How does that all fit into debt recovery, podcasting, and where does that fit in the timeline? And what was your role there?
Well, Radiogram Records is my pet project. It's my thing where I basically either find artists or I produce my own work in order to necessarily work together. For example, if there's music in a podcast that I've produced, usually that music comes from me.
Oh, amazing.
So, right, the music comes from me, which then at the end of the day may appear on a playlist from
Yeah.
Radiogram Records.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it may be published via Dialogue London Limited, which is a podcast and radio production and publishing area of it. So they're all my interests are tied together in a very sort of loose but informal way.
That's amazing. I love that. Absolutely love that. What's the plan for the next 2 to 5 years for you?
The plan for the next 2 to 5 years is, I think, as far as PRMS is going to concern, that will continue to be a consultancy, and I will just work with people that I want to work with. That's the key thing. I'm at that stage in my life. I can say, I'd like to work with that person. I want to turn their business around. I want them to look at things differently. I want them to see that there are other options in there in order that they can do. There's plenty of debt around. Debt never goes out of fashion.
Yeah.
So it stays there. It's my baseline. It's my safety net. There's always going to be debt. As far as the podcast is concerned, that's sort of under the umbrella of Dialogue London now, which is obviously going to be controlling all those podcasts. But there will be more podcasts to follow, and a couple of those are going to get released this year before the end of the year. So that will continue to grow.
And you'll be hosting them, or
Yes, yeah, I'll be hosting or producing those.
right?
So that initially, those are the ones that I'm going to be doing. So hosting those or producing those, and creating those. So I've that Trello board with the ideas of all the different podcasts.
Yeah.
Just be taking one from those. All right, let's work on that one now. Let's work on that one. So I want to build a stable, the same way that Wondery or Amazon has a stable
Yeah.
of podcasts. I want to have my stable of podcasts. Whether it's documentaries, whether it's true crime. Well, I've never done true crime, and and I try to avoid it. So, but it's
Very popular.
those are the things that people want, it seems.
Yeah.
So therefore, at the end of the day, I want to have the company to produce those. So there's a lot going on, and it's very exciting times. Very
Sounds
exciting.
amazing. Well, good luck in the future. Look, we're coming to the end of the interview. I ask the same 6 questions for all my guests. They're quick fire questions. They don't need a quick fire answer. First one is, what was the best decision that you've made?
Best decision that I've ever made. Best decision that I've ever made.
Apart from coming on my show, obviously.
Apart from that, that'd be one of the best things. But leaving, I used to work many years ago at Hackney Council. Leaving Hackney Council, that was the best decision. That set up a set of domino effects that
Right.
basically changed my outlook.
Amazing. What's the best piece of advice you've been given?
My mother, don't put your hat where you can't reach it.
I love it. That's brilliant. And how have you implemented that in your life? How has it reflected from that piece of advice?
It stopped me from necessarily spending money or doing things in order to, as I said, either impress people or do things. It's allowed me to stop doing stuff just for the sake of doing it without any kind of substance, knowing
Right.
that when it comes down to it, you have to go back to your base position.
Mm.
Hence the fact of your hat. If you put your hat too far out of reach, you'll never be able to get it.
You'll never get it. Who's helped you most in your career?
Who's helped me most? Wow. Two people. Two people. Lisa Newton and Bella Networking or Bella Rail World. Two people who I came up with via the networking scene when I first started, and
Are
who
they they're in debt recovery as well, or
no, not in debt recovery at all.
okay?
They're fellow entrepreneurs.
Okay.
And when you mentioned one of them has moved from the model that you described, which is the renting a property, to Airbnb.
Oh,
And
okay.
that's worked really well for her.
Oh, amazing.
So
Fingers crossed.
yeah, so I know that can work. I know that can work. So, but they are two people that I can pick up the phone, speak to, and say, this is what the idea is, or whatever the case is. We know a lot of the same people, etc., etc. So it's all good.
Amazing. Tell me about a regret that you have.
Regret. I regret that I wasn't a lot more risk averse. I regret that I was too risk averse to start off with. I
What's the
thought
most risky decision you've made?
the riskiest decision that I've made. I think it was when I left Hackney Council. That was the riskiest decision that I've done. It was a good decision to make, but it was very risky because I'd been very used to a good income coming in all the time. I built up 6 weeks holiday. It was, yeah, I'd got myself into a very, very comfortable position. And technically at the end, I could have still ended up still being there X amount of years later. But that was very risky at the time.
So it's really interesting. My experience is exactly the same. So I was at PwC for 12 years and I had a really good job. I enjoyed the people. The job was good and bad at bits, but I really enjoyed the people. I was very settled there. I was on a good path to reach pretty decent salary and pretty decent success in the company. But I left to go to a competitor. Now, people who have been on my podcast, they listen to my podcast, know is based around multiple bereavements within a very short period of time. And that leaving PwC and moving to KPMG, which then led me move to become an entrepreneur, would never have happened. So it was a domino effect, as you said. It would never have happened if I'd have stayed at PwC, and I would still be there now, and I would like bits of it and I wouldn't like other bits of it. So it's really interesting you say that. I can very much resonate with you that if it's sometimes decisions that you make aren't always obvious where you're going to end up further down the line, but sometimes change can be a really positive thing for someone to actually implement or move towards what they actually want to implement, which is what I wanted to do and become an entrepreneur.
Indeed.
So
yeah, it makes sense. I mean, as I said before, I think you're absolutely right. There are certain things that happen. As I said, I've fallen into podcasting. But everything in my life up until that point, the business point, the recording point, the music point, is all coalesced now in order for me to be able to do podcasting to a high level.
Yeah. What are you most proud of?
Keeping my sanity, I think. I think that's there's lots of things in this world that can make you lose your mind quite easily, and keeping my sanity is one of those things. Yeah, it's not something necessary to be proud of, but just basically, yeah, being able to actually still be going and still be
Yeah.
functioning and maintaining a reputation.
Running a business for 20 years is an impressive feat, Clayton. Don't underestimate that. Like, what do they say? Most businesses fail in 3 years.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's impressive. You should be proud of that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's just you just keep going and you just keep learning and well. But those are the things at the end of the day. Maintaining a reputation, maintaining my sanity.
Amazing. What does legacy mean to you?
Oh my God. Legacy means everything to me because when it comes down to it, what you leave as a legacy is so, so, so important. That's one of the reasons why I got into business, because I wanted to, even I don't have children, so it's not necessarily I'm going to leave a legacy to children, but to say that I walked this earth, this is what I did, and I tried to make things better. I think as Harry Belafonte once said, I did the best that I could.
Yeah.
That's what legacy means to me.
Amazing. And where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
The easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn, which is Clayton, Clayton, M middle initial, and last name Coke, Coke, as in the drink. That's the easiest way to find me. You can find my late payments debt recovery business, which is PRMS Limited. You can find it on Twitter and Instagram, which is PRMS Ltd at PRMS Ltd. As far as the podcast is concerned, the podcast is The Cash Flow Show. You can find us at on Twitter and Instagram, The Cash Flow Show Podcast and The Cash Flow Show. Yeah, I think that's about it. Those
Amazing.
are the places that you'll find us hanging out and me doing what I do.
Amazing. Thank you, Clayton. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've had a great time talking to you.
It's been absolutely wonderful. And thank you for allowing me to share my story and what's been happening for me in my life and my business life with your audience. I really appreciate that.
Pleasure. Thanks
I
a lot.
really hope you've enjoyed that content. It's a really fascinating interview that I've done there. So please do, if you are enjoying this content, please do give it a like. Please do give a subscribe. It'd be really good to boost the subscriptions. It really makes a difference to the algorithm in YouTube. So thank you for that. If you do hit subscribe, hit the bell icon and you'll get all of the content. You'll get notified when all the content is available. Thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. Thanks a lot.